Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel discussion today. We're going to be covering the regulation of e-mental health, and we're going to be looking at some of the promises, the pitfalls, and global lessons. Unfortunately, our moderator, Maria, is unavailable to be with us today. So I do work closely with Maria, and so she's asked me just to introduce IEEE Standards Association in a few slides. And just to let you know, Maria is the lead of healthcare sciences global practice at IEEE Standards Association. So the mission of IEEE SA is really to foster technology to serve humanity, and the vision is very much global. So it is about bringing a global technology community together to address important questions and try and solve for global conditions. And these numbers just back that point up, where there are many members across international boundaries, lots of technical societies and councils with disseminating information from reports, conferences, technical documents. And these just highlight a few points that the IEEE are addressing. And today we might cover some of those with the speakers, in particular global standards, as we have representatives from different countries. And I'd like to draw your attention to a flyer that was put in your delegate pack. And this is about addressing digital mental health and the ethics. This is a program that started 2 years ago, and it was in its infancy. We're really pleased to say that it's been renewed, and a subcommittee will be working continuously on driving this mission forward. If you have any questions, do reach out to Maria, myself, or the email address in the flyer. So I'd like to introduce our fantastic panelists. First, we'll be hearing from Elisabeth Steindl, legal researcher at the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law and Research Platform, Governance of Practices, both at the University of Vienna, Austria. And her field of research is digital law policy, particularly focusing on e-mental health, neurotechnology, and emotion recognition. So thank you. Then we'll hear from Maureen Abbott, who's the manager of Access to Quality Mental Health Services, Mental Health Commission of Canada. Following this, we'll hear from Christopher Boyd Skinner, who is a consultant with the World Health Organization's Quality of Care and Patient Safety Office in Athens, Greece, and is an intensive care clinician and digital patient safety expert with the Australian Government Department of Health and Aged Care. Now, it's important to mention that the topics we will be discussing here are highly sensitive and relate to mental health. So please be respectful as possible, as this is a very delicate situation. We will be covering topics of suicidal ideation and substance use. So if this is in any way triggering, please do reflect on this if you need space. Okay, so I'd like to pass it over to Elisabeth. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for the floor. It's my pleasure to be kicking off the panel on regulating e-mental health from an EU perspective. Perhaps you've come across in the past few days this ad that you see on the slide here. I don't know whether it's destiny or coincidence. CPDP week happens to be at the same time like the European Mental Health Week. I think we all have noticed that there is a growing awareness for mental health care and services. It has been growing over the past few years. There's also a growing demand for mental health services. And thankfully, there are also increasing efforts on a policy level to respond to this growing awareness and the growing demand. I don't think there's a need to go through all these different stages, but perhaps what you see at a first glance, just looking at the dates, is that that mental health is gaining momentum. There is building up a momentum, and perhaps I've picked out only 2 initiatives in May 2020, so around this year, this time last year. The European Commission was called to develop a long-term mental health strategy. And the start of this year, 2023, the Commission launched a call for evidence on a comprehensive mental health approach. So those two things are in the pipeline. The initiatives are in the pipeline. The question is legitimate, where is the digital in all of that? Well, the digital certainly is in the market. If you look at the figures for the market for e-mental health, digital mental health, that market is growing significantly. If you look at the diagrams here, the global market for e-mental health is projected to grow over the next 7 years from $23 billion to $71 billion. That is, I'd say, significant. And if you look at the second diagram on the right-hand side, I think the multicolored one, the red columns actually are the numbers, the confirmed numbers for last year, 2022, and the blue columns stand for the projected figures for 2030. So this market actually is growing, and in particular, from a European perspective, if you look at the same diagram, the second set is ours. So from that global market, we account, the European e-mental health market accounts for the second largest market share. Now, reasons for that growth, apart of course from the growing awareness and the growing demand, are also technology-based. In general, there is an increased digitalization of our lives in general. We have noticed that was exacerbated, of course, by the pandemic and is ongoing. In addition to that, of course, rising investments in that market and growing research and development on e-mental health apps in particular. But there's also a few technology-specific characteristics that make digital technologies very well suited to complement traditional therapy, psychotherapy, mental health therapy, such as we know that our times of crisis do not respect weekends or office hours, and so do digital technologies. They are available 24/7, they are available at the weekend, they are available even from remote places where we might find ourselves when we need these services. So there is a few technology-specific characteristics. In addition to that, I think we still have to bear in mind that mental health is still, it's getting better, I think, but it's still a very stigmatized field, and sometimes the threshold for making the first step to access help or a mental health service is the threshold for in an anonymous virtual room is lower than compared to perhaps sometimes the next step to access traditional therapy. At the same time, I'm sure many of you have seen the headlines. Privacy, data protection are crucial for e-mental health, for exploiting, harnessing digital technologies, which is also one of the reasons why we decided to organize this panel here at CPDP in particular. WHO lists privacy, data protection, safety, and accountability among the key concerns when harnessing digital technologies for e-mental health. What in particular in the European context, what we can notice here are significant, alarming privacy practices, failures in data protection and privacy practices, such as, for example, that data is shared, data belonging to very vulnerable users, highly sensitive data is shared on a wide scale, on a large scale. It seems to be a common practice, actually, to share and sell data to third parties for targeted advertising, for example. And in addition to that, there are also there's also a routine or a practice, unfortunately, of rather weak security safeguards in that area, which is surprising considering the content of the data. If we focus it, narrow it down to the primary challenges that we meet in the sector of e-mental health, also from a regulatory perspective, then I'd primarily pick out those two: privacy, data protection, and next to efficacy, of course. Efficacy is that device, that service actually able to deliver what it's set out to do, what it promises to do? Is there an evidence base behind it? Next to, of course, privacy and data protection practices. And from a legal perspective, we do have, of course, different sets of laws that would address these concerns, these challenges, data protection law on the one hand side, and product safety law, in particular sector-specific product safety law, medical devices regulation, and the question whether we are in the medical devices regulation within the scope of it or beyond it. One of the points that I'd like to stress here is if these challenges, primarily these challenges regarding efficacy and data protection and privacy, if these challenges remain unaddressed, first of all, it will have a negative impact on the people. Most and for all, on their healing process, people who are actually in need of these services. In addition to that, it will increase an already existing lack of trust in digital technologies for mental health and care. And both together actually will result, first of all, in the impediment to the adoption of digital technologies for a field such as mental health and care, although there is a great potential in it, as I've mentioned in the beginning. And it will also hinder the sustainable growth of the e-mental health industry in the EU. The market is going to grow anyway. We've seen the figures, but I think it's up to us to decide whether that market, that industry is going to grow in a sustainable way or not. I think one of the advantages of this panel here is that it gives us the possibility, the occasion to look beyond the EU jurisdiction and to see how other nations, how other jurisdictions are addressing and implementing e-mental health on a nation-wide level. And I'm anticipating slightly what we're going to hear in the next two presentations in order to give us a chance to embed it in my legal EU framework. In the order of appearance, therefore, and of the presentations, Canada is, as we speak, introducing its first national assessment framework for e-mental health apps. And it's developing a national strategy for e-mental health. And I'd like to point that out in particular, since the EU currently is about to start developing a national or an EU-wide strategy for mental health. Canada is already a step further and starting to develop a national strategy for e-mental health. Australia is even 2 steps further ahead, or perhaps 3 steps further ahead. They have chosen actually a twofold approach to mental health: hard law combined with soft law. In terms of hard law, they are addressing e-mental health separately in their what would be their medical devices regulation. It's the Therapeutic Goods Act that corresponds largely to our medical devices regulation. And in addition to that, when it comes to soft law, they have implemented already an orchestrated soft law approach consisting of national standards together with a certification scheme. Now, to be able to actually embed that or enshrine that in our own legal framework, perhaps it's a good moment to consider and reflect about the legal instruments that we actually have in our framework, in the EU framework. And in order to do that, perhaps it's a good moment to remember that, in particular, compared to other jurisdictions, we do have a very robust data protection framework. I know we all know about the flaws, and we are discussing them at length, which is very well. However, compared to other jurisdictions who have a very fragmented approach to data protection, I'm looking at Canada in particular here, but not the only one, of course. We do have a very robust framework, and we also have legal tools, legal instruments to address compliance weaknesses, such as would be, for example, sector-specific soft law approaches that are already outlined in the GDPR, such as sector-specific e-mental health codes of conduct could be, for example, or a certification scheme. What we do not have yet is, and where we again could perhaps look at Australia, is that these soft law instruments sometimes need the support of incentives, be it public incentives, be it financial incentives, to actually foster compliance with this soft regulation. I'm not going to go into detail regarding efficacy here, but just a quick hint, and I'm happy to discuss that later in the discussion if it comes up. There would be, of course, the option to adapt the sector-specific product safety law, meaning the medical devices regulation, in a way that we encourage more developers to actually consider certifying their tool, their device as a medical device. Last point here, last slide here. What we certainly can learn from other jurisdictions is that implementation of e-mental health works best if there is a thought-out strategy for e-mental health. And the point that I'd like to finish on is the EU is currently developing an overall general mental health strategy, and we would be very wise and prudent to incorporate a regulatory framework for e-mental health from the onset, given the challenges and the growing markets that we are seeing here. So far from me, and I'm handing over the microphone to Maureen.
Well, thank you very much, Elisabeth, and thanks everyone for coming to our panel today. So I wanted to start off by introducing the Mental Health Commission of Canada and what we do. So we have a unique mandate with the federal government to support provincial and territorial programming, and as well we work with organizations to support best practices and provide evidence-based policy recommendations as well as knowledge exchange. And the e-mental health team that I work on specifically, we try to focus less on that technology piece and more on that access piece. So everything we're doing, we're trying to move that needle in order to support access to quality mental health services. And e-mental health is another tool to be able to do that, because even if people aren't using e-mental health per se, we're reducing the backlog at different parts in the system as well. So one of the key projects we've been working on over the last few years at the Commission especially has been creating standards for mental health apps in Canada. And we know people are very interested in using mental health apps. We know that people are keen to choose digital solutions overall, especially youth. And there are a large number of mental health apps out there. And there was a recent survey completed in Canada that said that 73% of people said that e-mental health has helped them to deal with a moment of crisis or distress that would have resulted in physical harm or suicide. And then 63% said that they would not have sought care if virtual options were not available. So those are quite startling numbers, and also, it reduces the misconception that e-mental health is only for lower intensity services, where there is so many excellent e-mental health solutions for more higher and complex mental health services as well. So the case for virtual options and especially mental health apps is very strong in Canada, but there is a challenge that I want to address, and that's around the quality of these products. So unfortunately, we don't know if these mental health apps in Canada are safe, quality, or effective. And there was also previously limited standardization that existed. And we know there are great apps out there, but we know there's been instances where there's been the wrong crisis line number shared on an app, or there's been the marketing, there's been people's data shared for marketing purposes as well. So we desperately needed a way to be able to evaluate mental health apps in Canada to ensure they're safe and effective. So with funding from Health Canada, we started this journey about 3 years ago to develop a standards for mental health apps in Canada. And throughout this process, we had been working with ORCA, the Organization for the Review of Care and Health Apps. And ORCA is working with about 30 jurisdictions around the world. They're UK-based. And ORCA has a systems approach where they have a base set of standards it's about 5 standards, very typical data security and privacy, clinical effectiveness, etc. And then with each jurisdiction that they work with, you have to validate those standards for your specific context, and also see if there's any information to add on or edit as well. So I don't know if any of you attended the presentation yesterday in La Grande Halle about AI and the fundamental rights, but one of the biggest takeaways I had was around knowing your values. And that's really what we tried to do with these standards, is we tried to build out, what are our values as a country? And we also had international stakeholders involved as well. But we worked with about 200 Canadian international stakeholders to really co-design what this framework would look like. So just another item that we did as well was a public review. So we had that open for about 4 weeks to also gain some additional information from the public. So the assessment framework starts out with a glossary app overview, and then there's 7 different areas of focus that we're calling standards. And then within each of those standards, there's criteria that the app would need to meet. And there's 450 plus criteria total within those 7 standards, so it's not a quick read. And one area that really stood out for Canada, and that was not necessarily captured in other frameworks, but I'm sure Brussels being a global city, you can relate. It was the area of cultural safety, social responsibility, and equity. And Canada is very multicultural. We have an Indigenous population as well in Canada. So it's not surprising that this content came out, and we decided to make it into its own 2 standards. And this includes key topics such as Indigenous data security, gender equity, representation from the BIPOC community, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in the app content and visuals, usability and accessibility, and then also lived experience involvement in the app development. And that's also a core value for us in Canada. We had somebody with lived experience with mental health issues, and also an app developer included right in the core development team. So just some of the examples of the criteria for these items. So is the text in the app readable at a grade 5 level or below? Is the language gender neutral? Has the process been designed and put in place to allow Indigenous users to easily access, understand, and exercise their own data protection rights? These were all very important to us in the framework, and then also to our stakeholders. So we'll be launching our app assessment framework next month on June 20th, and that'll be available publicly on the MHCC website. In terms of accreditation, it is our goal to be able to create a national mental health library where the public can go to be able to access safe, quality, and effective mental health apps. But we do need additional investment to be able to get to this point. So we haven't been able to do that yet, but it's still a goal of ours. And we would love to have a voluntary accreditation process in Canada in that way. But we did have many provinces and territories coming to us and saying that they would really like to build out their own app libraries. So that's the approach that we have been taking. And they would really like to be able to, show their residents and be able to have a place for the residents to be able to go where they can access safe, quality, and effective apps. So we've then turned, sorry, I went to the last slide there. We then turned the assessment framework into an app review engine. And then we're going to be working with provinces and territories to be able to build out their own customized app libraries however they like. And then the MHC is also included in a case study in a white paper on the Global Governance Toolkit for Digital Mental Health, which is published by the World Economic Forum in collaboration with Deloitte. And I think that is how I met many of the wonderful people on this panel. So please feel free to use the QR code to navigate to the governance framework if you'd like to learn more about the app assessment framework. So another area, did you want to take the QR code? Yep, go ahead, I saw you. So another area that's of relevance to our team is e-mental health implementation, because like in-person services, e-mental health services, they only work well when they're implemented properly. So unlike Australia, we don't have an accreditation process for e-mental health in general, but we do have an online course that we recommend. And this is, it's free, it's self-directed, and it's designed to give mental health providers, leaders, students, and also just knowledge users the skills that they need to integrate e-mental health into their daily practice. And it also supports effective and person-centered mental health service delivery. And to clarify, whenever I say e-mental health as well, we use a really broad definition of e-mental health. So it's everything from text reminders for appointments, to wearable devices and telehealth, also artificial intelligence. So it's not just apps, for example. And this course, it's accredited by the Canadian College of Health Leaders as well. We do have a section as well on AI. I know that Becky is going to be chatting a little bit more about that, but that is an area that we are looking to expand upon a bit in this course. We do have some reports as well available on our website around the uses and trends of AI in mental health, so please feel free to navigate there. I know Becky is going to be talking about the biases a bit as well in AI, but really want to stress that it's really only as good as what you program into it. So there's a lot of learning, so we really encourage people to kind of know what AI can do and what AI can't do before they start getting into it. And I should also mention the course is available in English and French as well, so we're a bilingual country as well in Canada. Great, so lastly, I'll touch on the e-mental health strategy for Canada. So Elisabeth mentioned the strategy that they're thinking about for the EU, that you're all thinking about. And the MHCC has been mandated with developing its first e-mental health strategy by 2024. And this was really with the advancement of technology. There's been a call from stakeholders and governments and communities to have a strategic focus on e-mental health. So, you know, provinces and territories are really saying we would really need a policy document. Can you give us anything that we can use to be able to almost have a business case for e-mental health in our jurisdictions? And actually this graphic, similar to the other one, we had a national event on an e-mental health strategy for Canada, and we had this illustration done in real time, which was really interesting. So as people were speaking, there was somebody designing this graphic. But you can see that we really try to incorporate the international perspective in everything that we do. We know that Australia is a bit ahead of us in terms of that strategy. We did have a speaker there from Australia speaking to that strategy. And we start off with research, so a literature review, stakeholder map, and also an environmental scan. We have an advisory committee for the strategy as well. And then we have working groups, and on the working groups, we have those with lived experience included, as well as policymakers and other health experts. And just some of the important items that came out initially in the strategy, so we're still kind of 1 year in the writing. Some of the items were around navigation, so ensuring people know where to go in order to find e-mental health topics. Workforce as well, so ensuring that there's an investment in workforce. You're not just asking the regular healthcare workers to be able to all of a sudden switch to e-mental health. And then the principles of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility as well. And just one thing I'll mention as well, because Elisabeth didn't bring it up when we were chatting yesterday, we do have a 2012 strategy, an overarching e-mental health strategy. We did decide to include a link to that e-mental health to that strategy, but we did want to make the e-mental health strategy its own standalone document. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm including the QR code here for our website on the e-mental health webpage, and all of our resources are available there. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you all today. It's definitely a long way to come from Australia, but very grateful to be here in this room and also to see such a great level of interest as well. So my name's Chris Boyd-Skinner. I'm a clinician by background, as Becky said. I've also done quite a lot of work in digital patient safety with the Australian Government, Department of Health and Aged Care, and recently a WHO consultant in the Patient Safety and Quality of Care office in Athens. And I guess I just want to really thank Maureen for that summary of Canada's achievements. And when we were preparing for this panel presentation, we talked a lot about some examples of advanced digital mental health systems and mature technology models around the world. And like Canada, Australia is quite lucky to be a global leader in the provision of e-mental health services for a period of around about 2 decades now. So it's been very much rooted in the healthcare system for quite some time. Now, I'm not going to say that all aspects of our healthcare system are amazing, because there are absolutely some deficits, like all healthcare systems, but we have been quite progressive and forward-thinking in terms of both promoting digital mental health technologies, or e-mental health technologies, but also thinking about safety and quality standards for healthcare. And specifically for guiding that safe use of e-mental health tools and apps. So in this short session, I wanted to explore some of the context around e-mental health regulation in Australia, talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we're currently facing, highlight a couple of cases, recent high-profile data breaches, which are quite relevant, and then spend a few moments talking about the development of the National Safety and Quality Digital Mental Health Standards. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I thought it'd be quite useful just to very briefly describe what the regulatory environment for e-mental health looks like in Australia. And effectively, there's 3 interconnected pillars here which sort of govern the overall use, delivery and access to e-mental health tools and services. So the first is legislative mechanisms and instruments, and Elisabeth pointed before to some of those hard law examples. So we have our Privacy Act of 1988, and we also have a number of regulatory authorities with enforcement powers. So that includes the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, or the OAIC, and that's Australia's independent national regulator, which coordinates things from freedom of information requests and all privacy matters effectively, and data breach investigations. And they also manage something called the Notifiable Data Breach Scheme, where companies must legally notify affected individuals and also the OIC when a breach occurs where it's likely to result in a serious harm to a citizen. And then also, as Elisabeth touched on, we have the Therapeutic Goods Administration. The parallel there in the United States is the FDA, Germany, BfArM. So they do, to an extent, regulate software as a medical device, providing that it does fit within that definition. The second is workforce regulation, and we have registration and clinician licensing under the APRA banner, so that's the Australian Healthcare Practitioner Regulating Agency. And this is important because it really ensures that we have appropriately skilled workforce delivering e-mental health services. There's a number of bodies which govern professional standards and then also accreditation of training programs, which is also important because there's also that external assurance mechanism to verify that the training programs for clinicians are current and fit for purpose and also best practice. And then finally, we have an example of soft law, so these safety and quality standards. These are government-led, and we'll show you an example shortly of how these standards can be used to do things like support data privacy, equitable access to digital mental health services, and also generally improve the safety and quality of services for people with mental ill health, with substance use issues, and those that are at high risk of suicide. And I guess what differentiates Australia from some other countries around the world is that they are externally assessed, these standards. So we have external independent auditing agencies with the appropriate skills and experience come into these organisations and assess them against this set of national standards. And then we also have this question around mandatory versus voluntary standards in Australia at the moment. Some safety and quality standards are mandatory, for example, those for hospitals, public and private hospitals. But for digital mental health, these new standards are in fact voluntary. So it begs the question, will voluntary standards actually make a difference? Will providers want to adopt them in good faith? Or do we need some other kind of policy lever in order to increase uptake of these standards? So we're currently faced with a couple of big challenges in our big island nation. I think the first point that I'd like to make here is that, obviously it's no surprise to anyone in this room that health information, and particularly mental health information, is extremely sensitive. So I don't really intend to argue that it's more important than, say, financial data or other types of information, but what I would say is that there's a really heightened risk when it comes to mental health information being shared without patient consent, and the repercussions can be quite significant, as we'll hear from Becky shortly. We've had a couple of major large-scale data breaches in the last 6 to 9 months. Medibank is Australia's largest health insurer. 9 million customers' data was shared, ended up on the dark web. Same with one of our largest telcos, Optus, 4 million customer data. And then in the financial services industry, Latitude Financial, potentially up to 11.5 million customers. So data privacy and protection is very much front of mind, not only in the healthcare space, but across a number of other sectors as well. I think another big challenge in Australia that we're facing at the moment is trying to get providers familiar with the concepts of data sovereignty and data localisation, and specifically trying to get them to understand the importance of mapping where their data is flowing to and from, where it's stored, accessed and transmitted. And particularly if services are using offshore data storage arrangements, it's really important to know the risks and also ensure that service users are made aware of those arrangements if organisations do intend to keep their data offshore and not keep it in Australia. And lastly, I think things are really starting to shift, and it seems to be for quite a long time there was this level of complacency when it came to data privacy, and I think these 3 major data breaches have really made people wake up and realise, to the extent that the government recently changed and made some amendments to that Privacy Act that I mentioned on the first slide. They've increased the penalties from 2.5 million to 50 million, and those penalties are now more in line with the GDPR. So I think specifically in the context of challenges with e-mental health in Australia, since the mid-2010s, Australia was seeing this really rapid increase of e-mental health technologies. There was also quite a lot of variation in both clinical and technical elements of e-mental health services. And that includes variation in things like information security management systems and frameworks, privacy settings and informed consent practices. And so the government banded together with industry experts, with consumers, families, carers, mental health clinicians, to go about developing a set of digital mental health standards. They are a world first in the sense that they do have that accreditation, a formal accreditation process attached to them. And as Maureen pointed out before, in the context of these standards, they apply to apps, online services, peer-to-peer support services, and then virtual mental health assessments using mechanisms like telehealth, for example. Feel free to scan the code and download the set of standards there. There's 59 actions. I won't go into all of them, but they cover things like clinical and technical governance, the model of care that's used, and also there's quite a strong focus on partnering with consumers to ensure that consumers really are embedded in the governance of an organisation and also in the design and evaluation of services as well. Very quickly on the accreditation model, there's 4 steps here. The first is a self-assessment. Organisations gather evidence against those 59 actions. They then undergo an external desktop review, a verification process with that external auditor, and then the final outcome, if they meet all those 59 actions, is of course accreditation, and they receive the certification mark. And I think we'll talk about future regulatory challenges at the end, so I'll hand over to Becky. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Can I just have the clicker, Chris? Thanks. I'm going to whip through my talk because I'd love to hear from you guys. But just to introduce myself, I forgot, I'm also a panelist. So my name's Dr. Becky Inkster, affiliated with Cambridge University, Department of Psychiatry. Also the Alan Turing Institute in the UK, the Finance and Economics program, given money and mental health go so closely together. Also on the advisory board for Lancet Digital Health. Okay, so this is WYSA, an example of a provider that I'll walk you through. I'm an advisor to WYSA. It is a conversational AI system for mental health. I've been an advisor for 7 years since it was born. For 6 of those years, I had no conflict of interest whatsoever. We just worked in a voluntary, impartial capacity. Over the last year, I have decided to increase my hours and time dedicated to WYSA. So we have a financial agreement, and I do hourly work. So full disclosure on that. Informally, I'm known as the godmother to WYSA just because of shaping and nurturing and trying to protect this little penguin. I will say I could have done a GPT slide presentation for you, but that would be kind of boring, I think. So I went through the human intelligence approach using creativity. This is my daughter. She's 7, same age as WYSA. I asked her to write my talk outline, so this is what I'm going to do. Staying true to her words, WYSA is very safe, WYSA is helpful, WYSA cares, WYSA is AI. So that is the outline I'm going to follow, or I'll get in trouble. But before I do that, I want to say that this is a critical time for ethical AI and mental health. Now, we always hear the words critical time, unprecedented, but this is real, and this is the first time I've actually used those kind of terms. So I want to walk you through some sensitive examples. I won't name companies and I won't go into details, but this has been happening for a while now. We have continuous occurrences of things going wrong. So here's an example of a virtual assistant, and a user had mentioned they were feeling suicidal or had suicidal ideations, and they did want to jump off a bridge. And I'm sorry for having to rush through such sensitive content. Please accept my apologies. But the response from the AI was to provide a local list of bridges nearby this individual. I can't think of anything worse, but just wait. So then flash forward, a couple years later, we still have situations where the AI is encouraging, let's say, individuals to pursue, to terminate their life. It's very horrible to discuss. In this case, a human decided to put a bit of guardrails around this, and this was a fake patient in this example. But other examples we can see with enthusiasm, the generative AI has encouraged people to do really harmful things. And again and again. A lot of toxic and harmful things can come out of generative AI. I don't want to just scare you and be doomsday, but I think out of respect to people and humanity, we have to acknowledge that these things have been happening, and continuously we need to address this. And we are in Belgium, and I'm sure, or I expect that many of you have heard of this tragic case less than 2 months ago. This was first reported in La Libre. So this is the 28th. Out of curiosity, if you want to put your hand up, I am curious to see if you are aware of this case. Okay. So, pardon my French accent, but sans ces conversations avec le chapa Eliza, mon mari serait toujours là. This went global. This death by suicide of a Belgian man. And what was interesting is the company, again, I'm going to take my WYSA hat off just to speak as an academic, but the company, in my opinion, gave boilerplate response to such a tragic outcome by just signposting, saying, oh, go here, look here for resources. 2 days later, when Vice investigated, it's incredibly alarming, and I won't read out the content of their investigation, but they went back to this AI, and they talked about, the AI said some very horrible things. Again, I don't want to discuss this out of respect for mental health, but it is one of the most, I think, the most shocking example I've ever seen, and this is within the last 2 months of where we are today in Belgium. Now, WYSA's AI is on a different journey. So from 2016, we have been developing a unique form of AI. We did not start with generative AI. We took a different approach completely. I'll just put these all down in the interest of time. And following my daughter's rules, WYSA is very safe. ORCA, as Maureen had mentioned, we are in the top in terms of clinical validated techniques. Again, whipping through this Mozilla report, head and shoulders above others, evidence-based, working with Cambridge, Harvard, Washington, Columbia, et cetera, to make sure that we are safe, helpful, and caring. this is another example where when you work in mental health, you work everywhere. So this is an example of reproductive justice and the responsibility of technology companies. We certainly didn't think we would be in the middle of this conversation, but when the Mozilla report came out looking at pregnancy and fertility apps, we have people who come to WYSA to talk about all their life's problems. And so we have a paper coming out very soon on reducing depression and maternal mental health spectrum of events. But the point I want to make here is that they are disclosing things of fear of pregnancy or thoughts of abortion. And this is a very difficult space if you don't build in your privacy by design and your security by design, which I can come to in a second. So with WYSA, we put guardrails on from the onset. And the reason I'm showing you these numbers is because any company who wants to scale and have 500 million conversations with someone, or to use AI to deliver over 2 million psychotherapy assessments, you really have to get it right from the beginning, because it is life and death, as I've just mentioned. It's so important to get it right in mental health and health generally. So some of the guardrails, please come see me. I can discuss this in great detail. And we're on a journey, so we will continue to build more guardrails. But we always have a human in the loop. It's very important that when things become very serious, we can pass this off to a fixed procedure, a clinical care pathway. We also have algorithms that will redact information if we think that this is PII or very sensitive medical information. We want people to feel safe, so we remove this information fully from the conversation that the person has. We are only now just starting to build in generative AI, not into any products, but into safe practice environments. Again, we're very interested in what people think about this from a regulatory perspective. Right now, all eyes are on the regulators, and we're looking for support and help in our direction as well. But we are ready after 7 years to start to see how these could be embedded into case studies. And of course, working towards gold standards, looking to all these different countries and standards to help continue to guide us. And an important point, just before I finish up, is that an ethical business model. This is not something where a VC can just come in and sell data, not with mental health. So we are deciding what our future will be and our direction will be in order to be sustainable, but to deliver mental health and meet someone at whatever price they can afford. So it really is about changing the direction of the discussion about business models as well. And I say that because a fair few have gone bankrupt, some of the unicorns in digital mental health spaces, so, or they've lost revenue, and this is a disruption to clinical services. So this really hurts the patient directly if you don't value people over profit. So. But I do want to end on a positive note as well. So I work not only just with WYSA, but a lot of different providers, over 100. And when COVID first happened, I coordinated over 50 different providers across a range of spaces. And within 15 working days, we gathered a global snapshot of mental health of a user base upwards of 50 million people. This shows, amongst many things, that providers in this space are different. Not all of them. I have had approached by suicidal whistleblowers, and it can get very awful. But there are some really good players in this space who are willing to work with each other and work with regulation. Another example is API cybersecurity. So we've got a project not only to look at the technical vulnerabilities of API, but also the putting support in place for when a breach occurs and the victim support plan in advance. And finally, the IEEE Standards Association and the work that we want to do with our committee for the next 2 years. We'd love to hear your comments on that and work with providers and with regulators in that space. And so I will finish. Sorry, I rushed, just because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So thank you for listening. Merci pour votre attention. And Q&A begins.
Hi, I'm a PhD student at the Humboldt University. I thank you for your presentation. I would like to share my doubt about this e-health services, because you started by saying that the purpose of this is to serve humanity, but I don't think so, and I would like to share my concerns. So, first of all, I think you said that, so yes, I see only drawbacks for humanity and advantages for big corporations. You started by saying in 2020 there was an increase demand for this kind of application, and maybe it's also in correlation with the fact that people was in the lockdown, and so of course it might have been more a problem of like society than a problem of like the people themselves. But yes, so I would like to argue in favor of traditional medicine against e-healthcare. So also I would say that maybe the demand is growing for this application because the public health system is dying. And so, of course, the only thing that is left is this application, that if people are in distress, of course, they are going to use this. So, yes, I see 4 main points that go more in the direction of like traditional healthcare opposed to e-mental health service if we want to serve humanity. So first, I would like to highlight the fact that digital services involve a lot of pollution. So this is not the case in traditional medicine healthcare, because then you have to store all this data on servers, and of course it involves a lot of pollution. So why would we need all these devices to be running when we can just have people that don't pollute in the same way, right? Then another point is that I think a lot of depression is also happening because people are surrounded with the digital, because the digital is kind of like this fear that you get lost in, and or like this bubble that leads you to the depression. So I would say if you care about the mental health of people, it's better to go in the direction of more human contact. And it's also why people were so depressed during the lockdown, because they was by themselves at home, right? So again, I don't see so much of an advantage for people to stick to their phone in this kind of like cage, digital cage. Yeah, I think it's better to be in contact with a human. And then I think also a problem is, as you already addressed, the problem of like medical secrecy and the fact that then it's allowing many problems. Two possibilities. I mean, first, the commercial, like the fact that people would then buy this data to do personalized pricing or like targeted advertising, that they will advertise this jacket when they know that you are depressed, and maybe you will go into some compulsory online shopping, for example. So this is also like highly problematic, and this would not be the case in traditional medicine. And the worst case, of course, is the fact that even if now you say all this data is like a very, very well taken care of, we never know in which hands this data can end up, and it would then be a marvelous tool for biofascism. And I want to give this example of like the T4 project that was happening during Nazism. that so people with mental health issues was just killed because of eugenics. So yes, for all these reasons, and I'm sorry that because I feel very concerned by the topic, so sorry if it's a bit of a mess, but I really don't see why this is better than traditional medicine. I see it's only better because it has a great commercial potential and it has a great control potential. So it's not for humanity, it's more for big corporation. In my opinion, but maybe you will prove me wrong. Thank you.
In the interest of time, because we will get kicked off the stage at one point, I would love to have a really long discussion if you're available at some point, because you touched on many points. I would let the other panelists, if you want to jump in first, though. Aware of time, want others to speak. I have a lot to say. Would love to talk to you after.
I think you make a really interesting point about that concept of human contact. I think from my perspective, I don't disagree with that at all. And one of the things that a lot of clinicians that I speak with in Australia, psychologists and psychiatrists, they always go back to the line that e-mental health or digital mental health is there to augment face-to-face care. It's not there to replace it. It can be used as an adjunct to face-to-face therapy. And I think that it's really important to adhere to that model. And I mean, I'd probably stick my neck out and say that I don't think that digital will ever fully replace face-to-face care, and I think that that's extremely important. I guess the other point I'd make is that e-mental health is currently, at the moment, because of workforce shortages, there to support people in crisis with mental health illnesses and also with substance abuse issues when potentially there aren't any clinicians to address those issues face-to-face. So it does quite a good job in terms of addressing that lack of clinical workforce. But again, I would reinforce the point that I don't think it's there to fully replace it entirely.
Yeah, and maybe just quickly, I'll also comment, but thank you very much for the question, because I think you brought up a really key point with e-mental health, which is trust. And I can see that you're also really passionate about it. So thank you very much for raising the question. And I think it's a really important question. You know, one thing that we try to do at the Commission is as I mentioned, we try to focus less on that technology piece and more on that access piece. So even if, you know, perhaps yourself or anyone else is not comfortable with e-mental health services, it might be reducing the backlog in the system for those perhaps waiting in the emergency department as well, because we have been told and hearing many stories that there has been cases where people have said e-mental health has saved their life. Perhaps it's midnight and they can't get access to any other services, and they're able to log in and connect with somebody, peer-to-peer support immediately. So for us, it's less about that technology piece and more about that access piece. How are we increasing access for those that need it? And I think, there's many different types of e-mental health. So, I mentioned like some are even just, text reminders for appointments ranging to virtual reality as well. So I think the more complex and the more persistent and severe the cases, I think there needs to also be more stringent standards as well for e-mental health. But thank you so much for the question.
Thank you. First of all, let me say that I don't have any personal interest at stake. I'm not in the Commission, and I'm not working for any of the e-mental health apps. I'm just looking at the question, the topic from a lawyer's perspective, interested in data protection and privacy. What I see, what I hear from developers, from regulators, is that it's for them, it's not a question of is the one thing better than the other, is the traditional better than the other, or is it either or is it, I think I heard something like the traditional against the digital. I think it's a fact that we are living in a society that is increasing its efforts to digitalize all their spheres of being. I personally, for example, I enjoy and I prefer my analog calendar, my agenda, but I do recognize that other colleagues, for example, they prefer their digital agenda. It's very often also a question of personal preference, what people actually would like to access first. In addition to that, what your point was, and I think it's a legitimate point that you made about pollution, but that actually applies to everything we do in our digital world. It would basically stop every development on AI in particular, because we know that in particular the development and the use of AI is eating up a lot of resources. And again, I don't have any personal interest in that, but looking at that from a policy perspective, personally, I believe the development is going to happen. So if you ask me, I'd like to make sure that the development happens within a robust framework. And this is perhaps the position that I'd like to make. I think the development is going on anyway, but let's make sure that the development happens in a sustainable way and within a robust framework where we can still figure out which way to go.
I know we might be overrunning, but I'd also like to come at this from a non-provider, non-academic perspective. I do a lot of work in hip-hop, music, and culture, and working with communities offline, hard to reach, marginalized. It's important to meet up in person and to have that trust. We are looking at ways to embed technology, but to benefit the individuals in their own space and ways in which they think it will enhance their own personal journey. So again, if you wanted to talk about the importance of culture and community before any discussion of technology and how we can really drive, people can drive the decision making. There's so many ways we can explore on how to actually bring tech into the conversation and not just because of the hype. And then to your point of pollution as well, like we have electronic health records in the hospitals, and there's a lot of data pollution. Even when things are paper, they're becoming digital, so it's really tricky. Also, sound pollution as well. So I agreeing with your point that data farms and different types of technology that are housed are kicking out ultrasonic signals and all kinds of noise pollution too. So what is the consequence on humanity for that? Needs exploring as well. So, but I'd love to speak with you. I'm over taking my time, but that would be really cool if we could.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrew Adams, Major University. You've touched on this a little bit. There was a very good panel yesterday about digital divides and health in general, and how sometimes e-health can create more problems in access and exacerbate problems that are already there in access. And that's been mentioned a little bit. I'd like to ask you just to tease that specific issue out a bit. How can we make sure that developments in e-mental health, which include not just AI systems, but which include distance e-health provision. And it's interesting, of course, that we have a Canadian and an Australian on the panel. They are two of the countries which have some of the biggest challenges in diverse, very geographically diverse communities. It's interesting, Japan, which is well known as a highly urbanized population, actually has some of the same problems. There are great problems in provision of healthcare in Japan in the more rural areas, which are becoming depopulated but are not completely depopulated yet, and getting particularly mental health practitioners to be willing to live in Hokkaido a very sparsely populated area in Japan, other than the main city Sapporo, is very, very difficult. And therefore, you can improve access to mental health if you can let somebody live in Tokyo or Osaka and provide mental health services to people in Hokkaido via digital provision. So what positive issues can we deal with in terms of enhancing provision by using e-health in the mental health area?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And whenever you say access in this sense, I'm assuming you're meaning remote access as well? Including remote access, yes. Honestly, I think that remains a barrier for e-mental health services, particularly in Canada. It's underfunded, and it does require more funding, especially for Indigenous communities. There's areas that have to be accessed by a plane in Canada. You can't have a person, psychologist, in those areas. You can't even have somebody for physical health services in those areas. So, they perhaps can't have good access to internet. I have to be honest in that I really do feel that this is underfunded and people do need better access. One thing that we try to do to try to get around some of those things is to provide options for people. So, for example, can some items be downloaded in those communities? We have heard from Indigenous Services Canada in Canada that apps also are lower bandwidth as well. So that's actually really favorable. They kind of tend towards apps for those reasons. From our perspective, we're doing everything we can to sort of get around those issues. But the larger issue is really, funding. Like, those people need to be able to get access in those cases. Yeah.
And I'd fully agree with that funding element. I think one thing that's really important is to partner the technology with an investment strategy which includes the provision of devices, particularly things like data as well for underprivileged or underserved populations, to ensure that they have data on these devices to be able to actually access these types of technology. So it works quite well in the context that we're serving communities that live a very long way away from metropolitan services, but that infrastructure and the provision of devices also needs to be considered as well.
Hello, Jarek Gresser from VUB, and I have two remarks and one question probably to Christopher, but I'm not sure if you will be the one to address it. First remark is, when we're talking about mental health, this is very often that we are focused on depression, which is very important. And what I think right now is overlooked, that there are different also mental state conditions, which are also mental health, and they seems to be rather abundant, like schizophrenia, for example. And with different projects that I looked at, with AI, with medical IoT, and like new technologies or emerging technologies in mental health, I've seen only one AI project which was directly addressed to people with schizophrenia, and the project was actually to use the photo camera to check if what they see is real or not. And of course, depression is a lethal disease, and we need to focus on it. But we have tools, we have people, celebrities who are speaking about it. But we cannot forget about the different diseases. And I also include to this neurodegenerative disease. We sometimes, we can discuss about definition. If Parkinson's disease is also mental health disease. For me, it is. But some people claim that it is not. It's only the physical condition. For me, it is not. And I think that we overlooked it right now. And this is also the matter of diversity. The second thing is access to healthcare. And if e-medicine and those devices is something that we should invest in. We don't have to speak about Canada or Australia. It's huge countries, so yeah, okay, there might be a problem, and we need probably plane to go to some indigenous communities. But actually, we have same problem in Poland, which is quite small country. And last year, I was working in the project with people who live in the villages 50 kilometers from Warsaw, and they did not have access to psychotherapists and psychiatrists because there was no public bus. And it wasn't like, something unique. 1/3 people, so 10 million people in Poland, which is in European Union, and it's quite relatively small country, do not have access to public transport. So how we can give them access to doctors, to psychotherapists, if they cannot reach them in other ways. So this is for me something that we need to concentrate. We need to have in mind that it's not only a problem of large countries like yours, but also here in Europe. And the question is about informed consent. Actually, you've mentioned about it, and actually, it's also a legal question, Elisabeth. So I really have deep thoughts about it. How we can be sure that we received an informed consent from our patient in AI system, because like when we have this face-to-face conversation, the physician can assess if the person is capable to give informed consent, and how we can ensure it in such remote systems like AI systems or IoT systems or anything.
Can I just jump on your point and a point about humanity as well? You can go even further. So I live in the UK, very tiny. I don't know compared to Poland, but there was a study looking at midwives and midwives coming to women who had just had given birth to their baby. And they looked at when they asked, how is your mental health? And then they asked the mother, do you remember being asked? And the vast majority of women, even side by side in person, didn't remember or recall being asked about their mental health. So this mental health crisis it's huge. And even putting technology aside, it's really a big challenge, even face to face with people. And then just another quick point about eating disorders as well. With the high morbidity, this can lead to death very quickly if it's not resolved. So I agree fully with lots of different conditions, psychosis spectrum, schizophrenia spectrum, and a ton of things. So yeah, there is an overemphasis on low to moderate depression and anxiety, given the drive for many reasons. But just pass it off to everyone.
It's a really challenging question to ask or to answer around informed consent. I don't think that at the moment there's a perfect answer or a perfect solution. Some services that I've seen that are operating in Australia use a model where they ask for consent from the patient to proceed with a treatment at multiple points throughout the onboarding journey. They've also looked at ways in which they can try and describe the language around consent in an easy to read and easy to understand format. So that's one other strategy. But I don't think that at the moment there's necessarily a bulletproof solution. Happy for others to jump in.
Yeah, perhaps just very brief from the legal perspective, it's a question that has been haunting me for a long time now. The one thing is, of course, if it's actually really bad data protection practices, in the sense of, for example, that privacy policies are shady, are incomprehensible, are vague, you can improve that. That is one thing you can do. But then, for example, there was a case in the UK, a suicide hotline was sharing data with a research institute, and it was fully disclosed that the data will be shared for research purposes, and the people were informed and they signed it. But then in the media reports, one of the users, it caused a big riot and a big scandal when it became public that indeed that happened, and it was a fully research institute with a very good reputation too. However, one of the comments of the users was, yeah, perhaps it wasn't the privacy policies, but when you're at that crisis point and somebody tells you that your data will be shared with whoever you don't care, you're not in the position to actually fully consent to what is being asked. And that is difficult. And I have no solution for that right now.
Yes, I think it depends on, the type of e-mental health solution as well. So the type that is, for example, if it's an app, there's some different, ways around it. But I do think it comes down to transparency. So as Elisabeth was discussing, and trying to provide the user as much information as possible around, what will indeed be shared or not. So just to provide an example, in Canada, there is an app that works with Indigenous youth, so children and youth. That's a whole other question, right, around data and privacy and sharing and informed consent. But this app in particular, it deals with suicidal ideation for youth age 8 to 14 in Indigenous communities. It's actually looking to even reduce the age from 4 to 7. So that just gives you an idea of the generational trauma in those communities. But it measures the suicidal ideation. So what they do is they do spend a lot of time with the children actually explaining it in those terms and working with the parents as well around what they're actually consenting to at that level as well. And what this app actually does, it provides all of the data to the community as well. So the app doesn't actually store any data. It provides it to the community, and then everything is erased, and then it also provides it in an Excel spreadsheet and provides the instructions for the community members to be able to analyze their own data. So long story short, I would say for me, transparency is the key, and that differs depending on the e-mental health solution.
Just to jump on that point, I used to do work on social media, and we worked with gang members and youth who lived in high areas of violence. We were looking through Twitter to, before we started doing this is an academic study, we had a huge ethical issue about one of the lead gang members was deceased, and what right do we have to be trolling through their Twitter without any kind of connection with this individual. So one of the approaches we used was community consent, and we asked the local community, is this even appropriate for us to be doing this? And we heard a lot of different views on that. So just to extend the point that even if someone is deceased and their data has implications as well with consent, it's really hard.
I think we're at time, are we? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you all on behalf of Maria and the panelists, myself included. Thank you for staying and listening. And if you want to approach any of us, we'll be here if you want to. But thank you for your time.